What up? Carbon cycle lesson 2. Right then, so last lesson or two, we broke the carbon cycle up into a cycle within a cycle, and we looked at the size of the stores and the speed of the fluxes for the geological carbon cycle, which was the very slow part. Alright, that's naturally trying to be in balance. So we did that bit. And then in lesson we started looking at the biological carbon cycle. And this is kind of going to expand on that a little bit. So what is it then, what we're doing today? Well, last lesson we learned of a key word called sequestration, which is basically where carbon dioxide is transferred, or when it fluxes from the atmosphere into carbon sinks, such as plants, forests, the oceans, rocks and sediments, and soils. So we're going to look at that in a bit more detail, and we're going to split it into two. So we're going to look at the terrestrial sequestration of atmospheric carbon, so what's happening primarily on land, and then to understand what's also happening and the role that the oceans play in sequestering atmospheric carbon as well. Alright, and we can think about both of these as kind of pumps that pump it from the atmosphere into plants, soils, and also pump it around the oceans. So like I say, if you ever get confused with the carbon cycle when you go into any little bit in detail, you kind of need to take a step back. So what are we doing today? We are doing this bit, which is the terrestrial part of the carbon cycle. I mean, you could include burning in that as well, natural, but also anthropogenic activity like burning fossil fuels or burning timber, for instance, but I'm not going to get too much into that. And then what's happening in the oceans. So these two lessons, this lesson is going to look at those two things. Okie dokie. Yep, and remember, folks, the geological carbon cycle, very slow. The biological carbon cycle, which we're looking at today, a lot quicker. So we're going to do it in a little bit of a different order to the spec. We're going to do terrestrial and biological first, and then what's happening in the oceans second. Right then, I know you saw this last lesson, but there's some overlap, so I'm going to go through it again if anybody missed it. I think it's important as a kind of precursor to figure out what's going off this lesson. So, yeah, the speed of fluxes between the stores, depending on the processes, are at different speeds. So, the terrestrial, if you didn't make notes on this, then do so. If the terrestrial part, the bit that happens to on land, can also be known as the fast carbon cycle, and obviously plants are crucial in that. They take in or sequester carbon dioxide through photosynthesis, but they also release it as well through respiration. Nearly every living thing respires. We respire when we go for a run or when we breathe. Animals respire again when they're moving, and also plants do as well. So they don't just take in carbon dioxide, they also release it as well. Yeah, also decomposition releases CO2 into the atmosphere. So, I mean, depending on climate and things like that, this happens very quickly. In the oceans, carbon diffuses from the atmosphere into the oceans. It's held in dissolved form and in ocean organisms. It can then be transferred to sediments on the ocean floor, where we could get lithification, could turn into limestone, and these processes, if you think how long it takes for sedimentary rocks to form, then it's a very long time, so extremely long time. So that's the slow part of the carbon cycle. And then we've got the geological carbon cycle, which is also very slow as well, with the only exception is when we get volcanic outgassing, which tends to happen instantly. So these cycles within cycles are all taking place at different speeds. All right. Right, my students, in your activity booklets on page 10, student task 6, it says make notes on the terrestrial sequestration as part of the carbon cycle. So I want you to do that on that page in your booklets, please. So if you need to pause it now. But here we go. I know there's not a big space in your booklet, so there's a couple of slides worth of stuff to get through, so please write small. Right, couple of key words. Well, terrestrial sequestration just means using plants to capture CO2 from the atmosphere and then storing it as carbon in the stems and roots of the plants as well as in the soil. And these are all carbon sinks. So basically it's stored as biomass, alright, living matter. So definition of biomass is living matter. Plants take it out of the atmosphere, sequester it, convert it into sugars during photosynthesis, and it becomes living matter. Happy days. Gross primary productivity is the amount of the sun's energy that's fixed or harnessed by plants when they do this. They convert it to biomass and chemical energy. Alright, Year 7 science, photosynthesis. It's not got any more complicated than that up to now. Net primary productivity, or NPP, is GPP minus the amount of CO2 lost through respiration. So like we say, plants sequester CO2, but let's not forget that they also release it through respiration. So if we have a look at this big carbon cycle, which I keep going back to, you can see that here, look. Plants sequester it and take it in, but also they respire and put it back. Alright, so the difference between what they take in and fix, they then convert some into chemical energy and biomass, and they release the rest by respiring. So NPP is the difference between those two figures. Alright. Now then, I studied mainly, I'm a geographer first and foremost, so I love all geography, whether it's physical, human, but I studied mainly human geography at university, and I had a friend who studied physical, and I think he spent like most of his what seemed like his life in a lab analysing soils, and he used to tell me about it on the bus and the tram on the way home, and I was kind of like, well, yeah, it's sort of interesting, but I can think of better things to do with myself than analyse soils. But geography is such a diverse and large subject. There's something for everyone, and that was his guilty pleasure, if you like. Now, why did he rant and rave at me and tell me all about soil constantly? It's because it is crucial in the carbon cycle as a carbon sink. Alright, so let's see how it actually gets into the soil. Well, organic carbon stored in the soil is basically the inputs from plant and animal residues minus the losses through decomposition, erosion. So let's have a look then. Right. So, what's going off here? Well, if we've got the energy source, the sun, we know that plants and forests and vegetation photosynthesize, and you can see we've got a hand kind of pulling that carbon into the vegetation during photosynthesis. So they're fixing the sun's energy and converting it into chemical energy and biomass, alright, which is a carbon stored by itself. So carbon stored in the trees, in the wood, in the branches, in the leaves, it's living matter, alright. We know that plants and vegetation also respire and release it back into the atmosphere. Alright, oops. Okay then, so soils. Well, when these plants die, alright, obviously they fall to the forest floor and they end up in the soil. Also, this is a little bit of a simple kind of graphic, but as part of a simple food web or food chain, carbon's passed from the primary producers, so the plants, and then along comes, say, a caterpillar and eats the leaves and the plants, so carbon's passed along the food chain. Along comes a bird and eats the caterpillar, you get me, and carbon's transferred as part of the food web. But when all those things die, they end up decomposing and end up into the soil, alright, which you can see by the size of the store is very significant. Yeah. Also, soil releases carbon dioxide through respiration as well. So what does this look like? Let's have a look. Here we have got, this is what my mate were doing at uni, I think, for 3 years. But yeah, we've got two different types of soil here. We've got one that's not got much carbon in it, so there's not much, not many things have died in this and turned into organic matter in the soil. That's one on the left, whereas the one on the right is super rich in carbon. So if your grandparents go to the allotment and grow prize-winning onions and things, I'm guessing they like darker soil rather than lighter soil. Right then, bit of a recap. Again, don't copy this out like a performing monkey, please. Read it, understand it, make sense of it, and then shorten it into your notes, into student task 6 in your booklet. So, land-based carbon is found in plants, animals, soil, and also as bacteria and fungi. It's in more or less everything. Photosynthesis and respiration between plants and the atmosphere happens very quickly. Alright, as a flux. Green plants are known as primary producers because what they do is they fix or harness the sun's energy through photosynthesis. They sequester the carbon out of the atmosphere and turn it into chemical energy and biomass, which is living matter. So leaves contain carbon, branches contain carbon, the roots of trees contain carbon. But some of that is respired back into the atmosphere. Along come the primary consumers, such as bugs, beetles, caterpillars, herbivores, things that eat the producers, the plants. They feed on the producers, and carbon is passed along the food web to them, to the next trophic level. But they obviously need to move and breathe, so they respire too and release it back into the atmosphere. All these things eventually die. We all end up dead and part of the soil, folks. Other organisms feed on the dead plants, animals and waste, and they're the decomposers. When the plants and animals die, their remains fall to the ground and the carbon is transferred into the soil, and it's organic carbon because it was once living, but now it's kind of rotted and it's ended up as part of the soil. Just like we see in this picture. Lots of organic matter and carbon in that soil. Happy days. Now, the last bit that we need to understand is that carbon stored in the soil as organic matter. It's respired by plants, bacteria, fungi and animals. When this respiration occurs below the ground, it is considered soil respiration. So if we go back to this little diagram, we can see that just here, look, can't we? Yep. Okie pokey. What else we got now? As geographers, I mean, this is A-level biology at the minute, probably. Geographers love to know the where. We want to map it. Where does this happen? Yep, that's what you signed up for geography, folks. You signed up for figuring out where things happen, the distribution. So, if we look at NPP rates, the net primary productivity rates, so this is showing the amount of the sun's energy and CO2 that is fixed by the primary producers minus that lost in respiration. So how productive are different regions or continents of the world? Well, if we have a look at pink and red, what do we notice? Let's have a look. The most productive, I could do this by latitude, I guess, use some keywords. The most productive regions, obviously we've got the Amazonia, we've got Central African rainforests and Indonesian rainforests. Surprise, surprise, folks, the tropical rainforests are the most productive. And if you just visualize the rainforest, what do you see in your mind? It's not a trick question. The answer should be big trees, all right? And that's why, because there's so much biomass, there's so much CO2 and the sun's energy being fixed every day, because there's a long what's the word? For God's sake, Kevin, sort it out. There is long days with 12 or even 13 hours of sunlight every day. Yeah, there's convectional rainfall, so it links to the water cycle. Plants and vegetation and forests have got access to a regular water supply. It's nice and warm. It's hospitable for plants to grow, and they're photosynthesizing at an alarming rate and fixing that into biomass. Now then, we can see just here deserts like the Sahara, on the other hand, that don't have much of the Middle East, that don't have much forest cover, don't have high rates of NPP. There's not much biodiversity, and there's not much carbon stored in as biomass. Yep. So I just thought I'd pull that map up a little bit. I mean, you can analyse that and break it up further, but yeah. Obviously, also in really cold climates, like in tundra regions, where it's too cold for plants to grow, except for really specialised plants, which can grow in really kind of cold conditions. Again, not much carbon dioxide being sequestered, because there's not many trees, folks. A few highly specialised mosses and lichens, maybe. Okie dokie. Right then, it's evidence time, folks. Bit of crucial evidence here. Again, we're still on task 6. A mere 2% increase in the carbon content of the planet's soils could offset 100% of all greenhouse gas emissions going into the atmosphere. So, that is how vital soil is as a carbon sink. Yep, what's happened there? Oops. Okie pokey. So, lovely bit of evidence. That is how vital the soils are. Now, in key area 3, we start to look at how human activity can, and how changing land use can actually interfere with this carbon sink and the processes we've just looked at. All right. Right then. Next up is ocean sequestration. Right, the oceans act as a carbon pump, all right, which just means the processes in the oceans which move, circulate and store carbon. And we touched on this as part of the geological carbon cycle when we looked at how marine or sea creatures can kind of use CO2 that's dissolved in the oceans and then transfer it or store it as a carbon in their shells. And there's some overlap with that, actually, because this happens a little bit in the oceans. As far as the oceans are concerned, there are 3 carbon pumps that pump the carbon around, alright? And I'm going to start with this, which is not the most riveting picture ever. But these microscopic plants are called phytoplankton, and they are crucial. Oh, what's happened here? Right, here we go. And it's spelled like this. Phytoplankton, microscopic plants that live in the surface layers or near the surface in the ocean. All right, and there's billions of them. If you were to go to the sea, put a Coke can into the water, scoop up a Coke can of seawater, you'd have billions of these things in that Coke can, and they are crucial to pumping carbon around the world's oceans. So what do they do? Let's have a look then. Well, the first carbon pump. You've got this diagram in your booklet, so and the first thing I want you to do is at the side of that diagram is we need a bit of, I don't want to get confused with scale here. So the top 100 meters of the ocean, i.e. the surface or near the surface, that is where the first pump is operating. Alright, so this diagram can actually be quite, oops, so annotate that on top 100 meters. This bit underneath it is the bottom 3,700 meters on average. Yep, and that's where a lot of this, the second stage of the carbon pump kind of comes into play. So, what's happening then? Well, we've got millions of, whether they're large phytoplankton or small phytoplankton, for purposes of what we're learning, who cares? What they do is they pump or sequester dissolved CO2. It goes from the atmosphere, diffuses into the oceans, and then phytoplankton, can also call them microalgae as well if you like. They need sunlight to survive, and they sequester carbon via photosynthesis. Alright. They're also eaten by other zooplankton and fish as well as part of a food web, just like on land. But what they do is they create calcium carbonate in their shells and in their skeletons as they grow. Alright? It passes up the food chain, eaten by zooplankton and fish. The phytoplankton can die and accumulate as sediment on the ocean floor, or they can actually it can be transferred into the shells. Right then. Right, the second pump is called the carbonate pump, and it kind of involves a bit more of the deeper ocean in this stage. So a couple of things can happen to this kind of carbonating shells. First thing is it can build up on the seabed and become, it sinks to the bottom of the ocean, can build up on the seabed and lithify or lithification happens, and it can turn into limestone very gradually. But sediments and other dissolved carbon can also be carried by the currents, alright, which is the third carbon pump. Now the third carbon pump we can refer to as the thermohaline circulation, and I guess this links to coast topics quite a lot as well. So thermo just means kind of temperature or heat. Haline is salt, so you should be familiar with that word from coast when you learn about salt marshes, which is a halocere. So it's put the two together, it's kind of heat and salt circulation, and as oceans, if you look at them from space, you know, and you take a picture, it looks like they're pretty static body of water, but actually we've got different currents. Some are cold and circulate in the deep ocean on the ocean floor, all right, and some are warm and circulate on obviously the surface of the ocean. Warm things tend to want to rise in nature, cold things tend to want to sink. So it's this kind of pump that pumps the dissolved carbon and the sediments around the world's oceans, what keep it moving, all right. We're going to look in lesson at exactly how that works and why it's very, very important. Okie dokie. And I've got a little lovely fact and figure for you. I know you love your facts and figures for evidence. Here we go. We've just kind of realised, put into perspective, how important soils are as a carbon sink compared to the atmosphere. And the oceans hold 50 times more CO2 than the atmosphere. Alright, so obviously massive carbon sink. What else is there? Another little fact and figure. Phytoplankton sequester more than 2 billion tons of carbon from the atmosphere to the deep oceans. Alright, so again, massive carbon sinks, yeah? And just have a look at a few little I think this is phytoplankton kind of levels, or the distribution of phytoplankton. You can see actually in large oceans that are really warm, so the Pacific for instance, not that much phytoplankton. You tend to find them just off of continental shelves in shallower waters where there's a supply of nutrients. Also as well in colder latitudes. And obviously there's a synoptic link here to global warming, because if these parts of the oceans where phytoplankton thrive get warmer, then phytoplankton numbers decrease as the oceans are getting warmer in these cold oceans. All right, so you know the Arctic Ocean getting warmer can have massive impacts on this carbon sink. Yep. What else have I got here to show you? Yeah, so global warming could really affect their ability to sequester and transfer carbon into the deep oceans. What's this one? Let's have a look. Yeah, again, it's just showing phytoplankton levels. So, yeah, the dark green and the olive colours are where we find the most. You can see lots of it in quite cold oceans. Yep. Again, here just north of the coast of Antarctica. You've got links to El Nino with the cold water current just off the coast of Peru. That's where it tends to upwell, but in an El Nino year that doesn't happen. Yep. So all geography's linked for us. Right. Enough of that. I think I've gone on a little bit too much for that. Sorry. So, yep. I mean, you could do the ocean, the pumps as a flow diagram. Some of these graphics are actually in your booklets, but I just think it's nice to talk you through them. All right. Bring your notes to lessons. See you later.